The morning sun cast long shadows across the endless grassland when Martha Kellaway spotted the overturned carriage in the distance. Smoke rose from its wheels, and, even from half a mile away, she could hear the frantic neighing of injured horses. At 17, Martha had seen enough accidents on the frontier to know that every second counted when lives hung in the balance. She urged her aging mare, Bessie, into a gallop despite knowing the old horse had little speed left to give. The Kellaway family's financial troubles had forced them to sell their good horses months ago, keeping only Bessie for the most essential farm work. Martha's worn boots had holes that let in the morning cold, and her dress had been patched so many times it looked more like a quilt than proper clothing. But poverty had never stopped Martha from helping others when they needed it most. As she drew closer to the wreckage, Martha could see the full extent of the disaster. A magnificent black carriage with gold trim lay on its side in a deep gully, apparently thrown there when the horses had spooked crossing the narrow bridge that spanned Willow Creek. One wheel spun lazily in the breeze while another had broken completely off. The driver, an elderly man in a fine black coat, sat beside the creek holding his head in his hands, blood seeping through his fingers from a nasty gash on his forehead. "Help me," called a young man's voice from inside the overturned carriage. "I'm trapped under something heavy, and I think my leg is broken." Martha dismounted quickly and approached the carriage door, which now faced skyward. The ornate door handle was made of real silver, she noticed, something she had never seen on any vehicle that passed through their poor farming community. Through the window, she could see a well-dressed young man around her own age pinned beneath what appeared to be a heavy travel trunk. "Don't worry," Martha called down to him. "I'm going to get you out of there." The young man looked up at her with startling blue eyes, his face pale with pain but still handsome despite the dirt and obvious distress. His clothes were made of the finest materials Martha had ever seen up close, a navy blue jacket with mother-of-pearl buttons and trousers that probably cost more than her family made in an entire year. "Miss, this trunk is too heavy for someone of your..." He paused, clearly trying to find polite words, "for someone of your size to move alone." Martha almost smiled at his attempt at diplomacy. She was indeed small and thin, made more so by the lean times her family had endured, but frontier life had made her stronger than she looked. More importantly, she had learned to think quickly and use whatever tools were available. "What's your name?" she asked while examining the situation. "James," he replied. "James Whitmore." "And you are?" "Martha Kellaway." She studied the angle of the trunk and the carriage's position. "James, I'm going to tie my horse's rope to this door and use Bessie to help lift the carriage slightly. When I do, you need to push that trunk off yourself as hard as you can. Do you understand?" James nodded, though his face showed doubt about whether this plan could work. Martha quickly unhitched the rope from her saddle and tied it securely to the carriage door's handle, then led Bessie into position. The old mare seemed to understand the urgency of the situation and stood ready despite her fatigue. "On my count," Martha called. 1, 2, 3. She clicked her tongue and Bessie pulled with all her remaining strength. The carriage groaned and shifted slightly, just enough for James to push the heavy trunk aside and free his trapped leg. Martha immediately signaled Bessie to stop pulling, and the carriage settled back into its previous position. James managed to climb out of the overturned vehicle, though he had to bite his lip to keep from crying out when he put weight on his injured leg. Once he stood on solid ground, Martha could see he was taller than most men she knew, with broad shoulders and the kind of confident bearing that spoke of a privileged upbringing. "Thank you," James said, his voice sincere despite the obvious pain he was experiencing. "I believe you may have saved my life." Martha was already moving toward the injured driver. "Save the thanks until we get you both somewhere safe. Can you ride a horse with that leg?" "I think so," James replied, though he limped heavily as he followed her. The driver introduced himself as Samuel Morrison, and his head wound looked worse than it actually was, though he was clearly dizzy and confused. Martha helped him clean the cut with water from the creek and used strips torn from her own petticoat to bandage it properly. "Where were you heading?" Martha asked as she worked. "Whitmore Ranch," James answered. "About 15 miles west of here. My father owns the largest cattle operation in the territory." Martha's hands stilled for just a moment.
Everyone in the territory knew about Whitmore Ranch and the family's immense wealth.
David Whitmore had built his fortune through cattle, land speculation, and railroad investments, becoming one of the most powerful men west of the Mississippi.
She was helping the son of one of the richest families in America.
"Well then," she said, continuing her work on Samuel's bandage, "we need to get word to your father about what happened.
But, first, we need to get you somewhere safe. This carriage isn't going anywhere, and those horses need medical attention."
One of the carriage horses had broken its leg in the accident and would need to be put down, while the other had deep cuts from the broken harness but might survive with proper care. Martha hated to see any animal suffer, but frontier life had taught her to make hard decisions quickly.
"There's a town about 8 miles north," she said. "Millbrook. It has a doctor and a telegraph office."
"Samuel shouldn't ride that far with a head injury, but, James, if you can manage it on horseback, we could get there before nightfall." James straightened his shoulders despite his obvious pain.
"I can make it. But, what about Samuel?"
"I'll stay with him and tend the injured horse until you can send help back."
"Absolutely not," James said firmly.
"I won't leave a lady alone in the wilderness with an injured man and no protection." Martha almost laughed at the idea that she needed protection in country she had lived in all her life, but she recognized James's sense of honor and didn't want to embarrass him.
"Then, what do you suggest?"
Before James could answer, they heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats.
3 riders appeared on the horizon, moving fast toward the accident scene.
Martha shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun, trying to make out whether they were help or potential trouble. As the riders drew closer, Martha recognized the lead horse and its rider. Ben Crawford, a local rancher whose property bordered her family's land, was riding hard with 2 of his ranch hands behind him. Ben was known throughout the area as an honest man who would help anyone in need, regardless of their circumstances.
"Martha," Ben called as he dismounted.
"We heard the crash from our north pasture."
"Is everyone all right?"
"1 dead horse, 1 injured horse, 1 man with a head wound, and 1 with a possible broken leg," Martha reported efficiently.
"We need to get them to Millbrook."
Ben quickly assessed the situation with the experienced eye of a man who had lived through many frontier emergencies. "Tom," he said to one of his hands, "ride back to the ranch and hitch up the supply wagon.
Bring blankets and medical supplies.
Harry, you take the injured horse back with you and have Doc Henderson look at those cuts." Ben turned to James with newfound respect as he realized who he was addressing. "Mr. Whitmore, sir, we'll have you in town within 2 hours. Martha, your family's going to be worried sick when you don't come home for supper."
"They'll understand," Martha replied. Someone needed help. As they waited for Ben's wagon to arrive, James found himself studying Martha with growing admiration.
She moved with quiet confidence, checking on Samuel's condition and speaking gently to the injured horse. Her dress might be patched and faded, and her boots might have holes, but she carried herself with a dignity that impressed him more than any fancy clothing could have.
"Miss Kellaway," James said quietly, "I want you to know that what you did today was extraordinary.
Not many people would have stopped to help strangers, especially given the potential danger." Martha looked at him with surprise.
"Any decent person would have done the same thing."
"I'm not so sure about that," James replied thoughtfully. "In my experience, people often have reasons to avoid getting involved in others' troubles." When Ben's wagon arrived with soft hay in the back and warm blankets, they carefully loaded Samuel and helped James climb aboard. Martha insisted on riding Bessie alongside the wagon to make sure everyone remained stable during the journey to Millbrook. The town of Millbrook consisted of little more than a main street with a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, a church, and the precious telegraph office that connected this remote area to the outside world. Dr. Patterson, the local physician, met them at his office and quickly confirmed that James's leg was badly bruised but not broken, while Samuel's head wound would heal cleanly with proper rest. While the doctor worked, James sent a telegram to his father explaining the situation and asking for a carriage to be sent to collect them. The response came back within an hour, informing them that David Whitmore himself would arrive the next morning with a full escort and medical team. As evening approached, Ben offered to ride with Martha back to her family's farm, but she insisted she could make the journey safely alone.
James, despite his injury, walked with her to where Bessie was tied outside the doctor's office. "Miss Kellaway," he said, "my father will want to thank you properly for what you've done today. I hope you'll allow him to do so."
Martha adjusted Bessie's reins and looked up at James with clear, honest eyes.
"Mr. Whitmore, I didn't help you expecting any reward. I did it because it was the right thing to do."
"I understand that," James replied. "But good deeds should be acknowledged, especially when they come from someone who has every reason to worry about her own problems first."
Martha's cheeks colored slightly. "What do you mean by that?"
James gestured toward her patched clothing and worn boots.
"I can see that times are hard for your family. Yet you didn't hesitate to risk your own safety to help complete strangers. That kind of character is rare."
"Times are hard for a lot of folks out here," Martha said simply.
"That doesn't mean we stop caring about each other."
As Martha rode home through the gathering darkness, she found herself thinking about James Whitmore in ways that surprised her. She had expected him to be arrogant and demanding like most rich people she had encountered, but instead he had been respectful and genuinely grateful. His blue eyes had shown real warmth when he looked at her, not the condescending pity she usually received from wealthy folks. The Kellaway farmhouse sat in a small valley between two rolling hills, and Martha could see the warm glow of lamplight in the windows as she approached. The house was small and showed its age, with a roof that leaked in 3 places and a front porch that sagged on one side, but it was home. Her father, Thomas Kellaway, came out to meet her as she led Bessie to the barn. "Martha, where have you been?" he asked with obvious relief. "Your mother has been pacing the floor for 2 hours." Martha quickly told him about the accident and her role in the rescue. Thomas listened with the quiet pride of a father who had raised his daughter to do the right thing regardless of personal cost.
"A Whitmore, you say?" Thomas rubbed his whiskers thoughtfully. "That's a name that carries considerable weight in these parts."
"He seemed like a decent person, despite his money," Martha said as she removed Bessie's saddle. Thomas helped her with the evening chores, and they talked about the day's events as they worked. The Kellaway family had been struggling since a drought the previous year had destroyed most of their crops, and Thomas had been forced to sell their best livestock to pay the mortgage on their land. They were now only a few months away from losing the farm entirely unless something changed dramatically. "Maybe this Whitmore fellow will remember your kindness," Thomas said as they walked back to the house. "I don't want his charity, Papa," Martha replied firmly.
"We'll find a way to keep the farm on our own."
"Pride is a luxury we might not be able to afford much longer, daughter," Thomas said gently.
"But I respect your feelings."
Inside the house, Martha's mother, Sarah, and her younger brother, Daniel, listened with wide eyes as she recounted the day's adventure. Daniel, who was 15 and dreamed of seeing more of the world beyond their small farm, was particularly interested in her description of the ornate carriage and James's fine clothes.
"Do you think he'll really come to thank you?" Daniel asked.
"I doubt it," Martha replied. "Rich folks have short memories when it comes to favors from poor folks." But even as she said the words, Martha found herself hoping she was wrong. There had been something different about James Whitmore, something that made her think he might be the kind of person who remembered his debts and honored his word.
The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Kellaway farm.
Martha was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. She walked around to the front yard and stopped in amazement at what she saw. A magnificent black carriage, even finer than the one that had crashed, was pulling up to their modest farmhouse. 4 outriders accompanied it, all dressed in matching uniforms and carrying rifles. The carriage bore a gold crest on its door that proclaimed its owner's wealth and status to anyone who might see it. The driver climbed down and opened the carriage door with a flourish. James Whitmore stepped out first, moving carefully because of his injured leg but looking remarkably recovered from his ordeal. He wore a fresh suit of clothes that probably cost more than the Kellaway family spent on clothing in 5 years. Behind James emerged a man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of commanding presence that comes from wielding great power for many years. David Whitmore was taller than his son and broader through the shoulders, with keen gray eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his surroundings. His clothing was impeccably tailored, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his every word obeyed.
Martha's family gathered on their sagging front porch as the Whitmores approached.
Thomas had put on his best shirt for church that morning, while Sarah had donned her one good dress. Even Daniel had combed his hair and washed his face. Only Martha remained in her everyday work clothes, having been caught by surprise while doing chores. "Mr. Kellaway," David Whitmore said, removing his hat as he approached the porch.
"I am David Whitmore, and this is my son James.
I believe we owe your daughter a considerable debt of gratitude."
Thomas stepped forward and shook the offered hand. "Mr. Whitmore, sir. Please, come inside."
"Sarah, bring out the good chairs."
"That won't be necessary," David replied politely. "What I have to say won't take long."
He turned to Martha with an expression that was difficult to read.
"Miss Kellaway, my son has told me about your actions yesterday.
According to James, you risked your own safety to save his life when his carriage overturned."
"Is this accurate?"
Martha felt suddenly self-conscious under the scrutiny of such an important man. "I just did what anyone would have done, sir. Your son was in trouble, and I was able to help." "I disagree," David said firmly. "Most people would have ridden on, telling themselves it wasn't their responsibility or that they couldn't make a difference. You stopped, assessed the situation, and took effective action despite considerable personal risk.
That demonstrates character." James stepped forward beside his father. "Miss Kellaway, I want you to know that I will never forget what you did for me yesterday."
"And neither will I," David added.
"The Whitmore family pays its debts, Miss Kellaway. All of them."
David reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins.
"Please accept this small token of our appreciation." Martha's face reddened, and she stepped back.
"Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate your gratitude, but I can't accept money for doing what was right."
David's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. May I ask why not?"
"Because," Martha said, lifting her chin proudly, "helping people shouldn't be something you get paid for.
It should be something you do because it's right."
A silence fell over the group that stretched uncomfortably long. Thomas and Sarah exchanged worried glances, knowing how desperately their family needed money but also understanding their daughter's principles. Finally, David Whitmore smiled. "Miss Kellaway, that is exactly the response I hope to hear from you." He turned to Thomas.
"Mr. Kellaway, I understand you're a farmer. How many acres do you work?"
"About 200, sir," Thomas replied cautiously. "Though times have been difficult lately." "I'm sure they have," David said thoughtfully.
"Tell me, would you be interested in a business proposition?"
The conversation that followed would change the Kellaway family's life forever, though none of them could have predicted it in that moment. David Whitmore was a man who understood the value of good character when he saw it, and he had seen something in Martha that impressed him more than her family's poverty concerned him. What the Kellaways didn't know was that David Whitmore had come to their farm with more than gratitude on his mind. He had come with a plan that would test Martha's character further and potentially provide solutions to problems that both families faced, though in very different ways. The prairie wind stirred the dust around the grand carriage and the humble farmhouse as two very different worlds prepared to collide in ways that none of them could have imagined. David Whitmore walked slowly around the Kellaway property, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. The barn needed new boards on its north side, the fence posts were rotting in several places, and the field showed clear signs of the drought damage that had devastated so many farms in the territory. But he also saw something else, evidence of hard work and careful management despite limited resources. "Mr. Kellaway," David said, "I have a proposition that might benefit both our families. I'm always looking for reliable suppliers for my ranch operations, and I believe your farm could serve that purpose." Thomas shifted nervously on his feet. "Sir, I'm not sure we have much to offer a spread as large as yours.
Our operation is pretty small."
"Small but well managed," David observed. "I can see that you take care of your land and equipment despite financial constraints.
That tells me more about your character than the size of your operation does."
James watched the conversation with interest, though his attention kept drifting to Martha, who stood quietly beside her family. She was listening carefully to his father's words, but James could see the wariness in her expression. She clearly didn't trust unexpected generosity from wealthy strangers, which only increased his respect for her judgment.
"What kind of arrangement did you have in mind?" Thomas asked carefully. David smiled. "I need a reliable supplier of vegetables and grains for my ranch hands. Good food is essential for keeping good workers, and I'm willing to pay premium prices for quality produce delivered on schedule. I'm also in need of someone to manage a horse breeding program I'm considering. That would require someone with excellent judgment about animals and people alike." He paused and looked directly at Martha. "I believe your daughter demonstrated exactly that kind of judgment yesterday." Martha's eyes widened. "Sir, I don't know anything about horse breeding." "But, you know horses," David replied. "I saw how you handled your mare yesterday, and James told me how quickly you assessed the situation with our injured animals. Good instincts can't be taught, Miss Kellaway. Everything else can be learned." Sarah Kellaway stepped forward, unable to remain quiet any longer. "Mr. Whitmore, what exactly are you proposing?" David turned to face the entire family. "I'm proposing a partnership. The Kellaways would contract to supply specific agricultural products to Whitmore Ranch at guaranteed prices for the next 5 years. That would provide you with stable income and allow you to plan your planting accordingly. In exchange, Miss Martha would spend 3 days each week at my ranch, learning the horse business and helping to establish the breeding program." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind rustling through the prairie grass. Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances that spoke of years of shared hardship and the desperate hope that their luck might finally be changing. "That's a very generous offer," Thomas said slowly, "but I'm not sure we can accept it." "Why not?" David asked. Thomas glanced at his daughter before answering. "Because it sounds too good to be true. In my experience, when something sounds too good to be true, it usually is." David nodded approvingly. "A wise attitude, Mr. Kellaway. Let me be completely honest with you about my motivations." He walked to the edge of the Kellaways' front porch and turned to face them all. "My son James is my only heir, and he will inherit one of the largest fortunes in the country when I die. This wealth brings great responsibility, but it also brings great danger. There are many people who would marry James purely for his money, without caring about his character or happiness." James looked uncomfortable at this frank discussion of his future, but he didn't interrupt his father. "Yesterday," David continued, "James met a young woman who risked her own safety to save his life. When we offered to reward her, she refused payment because she believed helping others was simply the right thing to do. That kind of character is rare in any social class, but it's especially rare among people who have had much contact with great wealth." Martha felt her cheeks burning as she realized where this conversation was heading. "Mr. Whitmore, if you think that I..." David held up his hand. "Please, let me finish. I'm not proposing anything improper or unreasonable. I'm simply creating an opportunity for 2 young people of good character to get to know each other better. If friendship develops, that would be wonderful. If something deeper develops, that would be even better. If nothing develops beyond mutual respect, then at least my horses will benefit from excellent care and your family will benefit from financial stability." Thomas frowned deeply. "You're talking about using my daughter as bait to catch your son a wife." "I'm talking about giving 2 young people a chance to discover whether they have anything in common beyond the circumstances that brought them together," David corrected firmly. "There would be no pressure, no expectations, and no consequences if they decide they don't suit each other. Martha would be paid fair wages for her work with the horses, regardless of any personal relationship that might or might not develop." James finally spoke up. "Father, perhaps we should let Miss Kellaway speak for herself." All eyes turned to Martha, who stood very straight despite the intensity of the attention focused on her. "Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate your confidence in my abilities, but I'm not comfortable with the idea that my work performance might be judged based on whether your son and I become friends." "Then, let me make this simple," David replied. "The horse breeding position exists because I genuinely need someone with good instincts to help develop that part of my business. Your family's financial situation exists because of circumstances beyond your control. These are separate problems that can be addressed separately. If you choose to accept the job, you'll be evaluated solely on how well you handle the horses and manage the program. Your personal relationship with James, or lack thereof, will have no bearing on your employment. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper. I've had my lawyer draw up a contract that specifies exactly what I'm offering. Take time to read it, discuss it as a family, and give me your answer in 1 week. If you decide to accept, we'll start with a trial period to make sure the arrangement works for everyone involved. David handed the contract to Thomas, then turned to James. Son, I think it's time we let this family discuss our proposition in private. As the Whitmores prepared to leave, James approached Martha one more time. Miss Kellaway, I want you to know that I had no idea my father was going to make this offer. But I think you should also know that I would very much like the opportunity to get to know you better, completely separate from any business arrangement. Martha looked into his sincere blue eyes and felt something flutter in her chest that she had never experienced before. Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate your honesty. Will you consider it? James asked. Not the business proposition, but the possibility of friendship? I'll consider it, Martha replied quietly. After the Whitmores departed, the Kellaway family sat around their kitchen table and read through the contract in detail. The terms were even more generous than David's verbal description had suggested. The agricultural contracts would guarantee enough income to save their farm and provide comfortable living for the next 5 years. Martha's position would pay wages higher than most men earned in town, plus room and board on the days she worked at the ranch. It's almost too good to believe, Sarah murmured as she studied the numbers. Daniel, who had been silent throughout the Whitmores' visit, suddenly spoke up. Martha, you'd be crazy not to take this job. Do you know what we could do with this kind of money? Money isn't everything, Martha replied, though she couldn't deny the appeal of financial security. Thomas set the contract down and looked at his daughter seriously. Martha, what are you really worried about? The work? The Whitmores? Or something else? Martha stared at her hands for a long moment before answering. I'm worried about losing myself. Rich people live differently than we do, Papa. They have different values, different priorities. What if I start working there and begin to think their way is better than ours? What if you do? Thomas asked gently. Would that necessarily be a bad thing? We're honest people, Martha said firmly. We work hard, we help our neighbors, and we don't put on airs. I don't want to become someone who looks down on folks like us. Sarah reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. Sweetheart, your character isn't going to change because you work with horses for rich people. And if this James Whitmore is half the man he seems to be, he'll value your honesty and work ethic, not try to change them. Over the next 3 days, the Kellaway family discussed the proposition from every possible angle. They consulted with Ben Crawford, who assured them that David Whitmore had a reputation for keeping his word and treating his employees fairly. They talked to other farmers who had done business with Whitmore Ranch and heard only positive reports. On the 4th day, Martha made her decision. I'm going to accept the job, she announced at breakfast. Not because of James, and not because I want to marry into money. I'm going to accept it because we need the income, and because I think I might actually be good at working with horses. Thomas smiled proudly at his daughter. That's exactly the right reason to take a job. But, Martha continued, I'm going to set some ground rules for myself. I won't change who I am to fit into their world. I won't pretend to be something I'm not. And if James or anyone else at that ranch treats me with disrespect because of where I come from, I'll quit immediately. Fair enough, Sarah agreed. When will you tell them? Today, Martha decided. I'll ride over there this afternoon and give them my answer. The journey to Whitmore Ranch took Martha 2 hours on Bessie's back. She had dressed in her best clothes, which meant her second best dress and boots with only 1 hole instead of 3, but she still felt underdressed for visiting such an important place. The ranch was even more impressive than she had imagined.
The main house was a massive two-story building with white columns and a wraparound porch that looked like something from a picture book. The barn was larger than most houses in town, and the corrals held dozens of beautiful horses that were clearly worth more money than most people would see in their entire lives. A ranch hand directed Martha to the main house, where a well-dressed housekeeper led her to David Whitmore's study. The room was filled with leather-bound books, expensive furniture, and paintings that probably cost more than the Kellaway farm was worth. David rose from behind a massive oak desk when Martha entered.
"Miss Kellaway, how nice to see you again. Have you reached a decision about our proposition?"
"Yes, sir, I have," Martha replied, standing straight and looking him directly in the eye. "I'd like to accept the position, with one modification to the contract."
David's eyebrows rose. "Oh? What modification did you have in mind?"
"I want it clearly stated that my employment is based solely on my performance with the horses, and that any personal relationship I might or might not develop with your son will have no bearing on my job security."
David smiled broadly. "Miss Kellaway, that amendment is exactly what I hoped you would request. Consider it done."
He called for his secretary to make the change to the contract, then extended his hand to Martha. "Welcome to Whitmore Ranch, Miss Kellaway.
I think this is going to be a very interesting partnership."
As Martha shook his hand, she felt both excitement and nervousness about the path she was choosing. She had no way of knowing that her decision would set in motion a series of events that would transform not only her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. That evening, James joined his father for dinner in the ranch's elegant dining room. The meal was served on china plates with real silver utensils, and the conversation was polite and refined as always. But James found himself thinking about Martha Kellaway eating supper with her family around their simple kitchen table, and wondering which setting felt more like home. "She accepted the position," David told his son over dessert.
"I'm glad," James replied. "When will she start?" "Monday morning.
I've arranged for her to stay in the guest quarters behind the main house on the nights she works here.
Mrs.
Henderson will show her around and help her get settled." James nodded, but his father could see the young man's mind was elsewhere. "James," David said carefully, "I want you to understand something.
I didn't arrange this situation to force anything between you and Miss Kellaway.
I arranged it because I genuinely believe she has the qualities that would make both a good horse trainer and a good partner for someone of our social position. But the choice of whether to pursue friendship with her is entirely yours."
"And entirely hers," James added.
"Of course," David agreed. "The last thing any of us wants is for her to feel pressured or obligated because of the financial arrangement.
That would poison any relationship before it could begin."
James set down his coffee cup and looked at his father seriously.
"What if she's not interested in me romantically? What if she simply wants to do her job and go home to her family?"
"Then, she'll do excellent work with our horses, your family will benefit from the agricultural contracts, and everyone will be better off than they were before," David replied.
"There's no shame in that outcome."
But, privately, David Whitmore suspected that his son was already half in love with the brave young woman who had risked her safety to save his life. And, based on the way Martha had looked at James during their conversations, David suspected the feeling might be mutual, even if neither young person was ready to admit it yet. The question was whether two people from such different worlds could find enough common ground to build something lasting together. David had created the opportunity, but the rest would be up to James and Martha to discover for themselves. As Martha prepared for bed that night in her family's small farmhouse, she found herself looking forward to Monday morning with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that kept her awake long past her usual bedtime. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter in her life, one that might lead to possibilities she had never dared to imagine. But Martha Kellaway was not a woman who backed down from challenges, and she was determined to succeed at this opportunity through her own efforts and abilities. Whatever the future might hold, she would meet it with the same courage and integrity that had led her to stop and help a stranger in distress on a lonely prairie road. The wind that blew across the grassland that night carried the promise of changes to come, changes that would test the character of everyone involved and ultimately prove that true worth had nothing to do with the size of someone's bank account. Martha's first morning at Whitmore Ranch began before dawn. just as every morning of her life had begun on her family's farm. She had arrived the previous evening and spent the night in guest quarters that were more luxurious than any place she had ever slept, complete with running water, electric lights, and a bed with sheets softer than anything she had imagined possible. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, had been kind but reserved during Martha's orientation, explaining the ranch's routines and expectations with professional courtesy. The other staff members she met seemed curious about the poor farm girl who had somehow earned a position of responsibility, but they were polite enough not to ask direct questions about her background. The head horseman, a weathered cowboy named Jake Murphy, met Martha at the stables as the sun was rising over the eastern hills. Jake had worked with horses for 40 years and was known throughout the territory for his skill with difficult animals. David Whitmore had specifically asked him to evaluate Martha's abilities and provide honest feedback about her potential. "So you're the young lady who's going to help us breed horses," Jake said, not unkindly but with obvious skepticism. "Ever worked with breeding stock before?" "No, sir," Martha replied honestly. "But I've worked with horses all my life, and I learn quickly." Jake nodded approvingly at her straightforward answer. "Good. Folks who pretend to know more than they do cause nothing but trouble around animals. Come on, let me show you what we're working with." The breeding program David Whitmore envisioned was ambitious. He wanted to develop a line of horses that combined the speed and intelligence of thoroughbreds with the endurance and hardiness needed for ranch work. It was a complex undertaking that required careful selection of bloodlines, meticulous record-keeping, and excellent judgment about which animals to breed together. Jake led Martha through the breeding barn, introducing her to each horse and explaining its lineage and characteristics. Martha listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated her genuine interest in learning. By the end of the first hour, Jake's opinion of her had begun to shift. "You've got a good eye," he admitted as Martha correctly identified which of two similar-looking mares had better conformation for ranch work. "And you're not afraid to handle them, which is more than I can say for some folks who come around here." As the morning progressed, Martha threw herself into learning every aspect of the operation. She studied breeding charts, practiced reading pedigrees, and spent time observing each horse's temperament and behavior. Her notebook, a simple thing she had brought from home, quickly filled with observations and questions. It was nearly noon when James appeared at the barn, dressed in work clothes and leading a magnificent black stallion. Martha had been so absorbed in her work that she hadn't thought about him all morning, but seeing him again made her pulse quicken in a way she found both exciting and unsettling. "Good morning, Miss Kellaway," James said with a warm smile. "How is your first day progressing?" "Very well, thank you," Martha replied, determined to keep their interaction professional. Jake has been an excellent teacher. James's stallion, a powerful animal named Thunder, was one of the foundation sires for the breeding program. As James led the horse toward his stall, Thunder suddenly reared and pulled away, spooked by something only he could see or smell. Without thinking, Martha stepped forward and spoke to the agitated animal in a calm, steady voice. "Easy, boy. Easy now." She approached slowly, her movements confident but non-threatening, until she was close enough to place her hand on Thunder's neck. The stallion calmed immediately under her touch, lowering his head and allowing her to stroke his muzzle. James watched in amazement as the horse that had been fighting him moments earlier now stood quietly under Martha's gentle influence. "That's remarkable," James said. "Thunder is usually much more difficult to handle when he's upset. Animals can sense when someone is nervous or afraid," Martha explained, continuing to pet the stallion. "If you stay calm and confident, they usually respond the same way." Jake had been watching the entire interaction with professional interest. "Miss, you've got a gift with horses that can't be taught. I've seen plenty of people who know all the technical aspects of breeding but can't actually work with the animals. You've got both." Over the following weeks, Martha proved Jake's assessment correct. She threw herself into learning everything about horse breeding with the same determination she had always applied to farm work. She studied bloodlines late into the evening, practiced handling different types of horses during the day, and asked endless questions of anyone willing to teach her. More importantly, she began to develop genuine expertise. Her instincts about which horses would work well together proved remarkably accurate, and her ability to calm difficult animals made her invaluable during breeding procedures. David Whitmore, who made a point of checking on her progress regularly, was impressed by both her dedication and her natural talent. The relationship between Martha and James developed slowly and naturally during this time. James was genuinely interested in the breeding program and often worked alongside Martha and Jake. As they spent time together, they discovered shared interests in books, music, and discussions about the future of the frontier. James was surprised to find that Martha was much better educated than her circumstances might suggest. Despite the family's financial problems, Thomas and Sarah Kellaway had prioritized their children's learning, and Martha had read widely from the small collection of books they owned. She could discuss literature and current events with an intelligence that impressed James more than any formal education might have. For her part, Martha was pleasantly surprised to discover that James's privileged upbringing hadn't made him arrogant or lazy. He worked hard alongside the ranch hands, treated everyone with respect regardless of their position, and showed genuine interest in improving the ranch's operations rather than simply inheriting his father's wealth. Their friendship deepened gradually through shared work and conversation. James began staying later at the stables to help Martha with evening chores, and she found herself looking forward to these quiet conversations as much as she enjoyed working with the horses. One evening in late autumn, as they were cleaning tack together in the barn's tack room, James finally addressed the underlying tension that had been building between them. "Martha," he said quietly, "I hope you know that my feelings for you have nothing to do with my father's business arrangements with your family." Martha's hands stilled on the bridle she was cleaning. "What feelings are those, James?" "I think you know," he replied, moving closer to where she stood. "I think I've been half in love with you since the day you pulled me out of that overturned carriage." Martha set down the bridle and turned to face him fully. "James, we come from very different worlds. What future could there possibly be for feelings between us?" "I don't know," James admitted honestly. "But I'd like the chance to find out, if you're willing." Before Martha could respond, they heard voices approaching the barn. Jake's distinctive drawl was unmistakable as he spoke to someone Martha didn't recognize. "The breeding program's been going real well," Jake was saying. "That Kellaway girl has turned out to be exactly what we needed. Smart as a whip and better with horses than most folks I've worked with." "Is it true she's sweet on young Whitmore?" the other voice asked. "Can't say for sure," Jake replied diplomatically. "But they sure spend a lot of time talking when they think nobody's watching." Martha felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment. It was one thing to develop feelings for James in private, but quite another to realize that the entire ranch staff was speculating about their relationship. James saw her distress and spoke quietly. "Martha, what other people think doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is what you think and feel." "But it does matter," Martha replied. "If people believe I'm only here because of my relationship with you, it undermines everything I've accomplished on my own merit." Before James could respond, the barn door opened and Jake entered with Tom Bradley, one of the neighboring ranchers. Both men nodded politely to Martha and James before continuing their conversation about cattle prices. The interruption gave Martha time to think, and by the time Jake and Tom left, she had made a decision that would surprise everyone involved. "James," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course." "If your father had never made this arrangement, if we had met under completely different circumstances, would you still be interested in getting to know me?" James didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. In fact, I think I would have been more confident about approaching you if there weren't all these business complications involved." Martha studied his face carefully, looking for any sign of insincerity. What she saw was the same honest directness that had impressed her from their first meeting. "All right," she said finally. "Then, I want to propose something." "What do you have in mind?" "I want to prove to myself and everyone else that I can succeed here on my own merits, completely independent of any personal relationship with you. I think we should avoid spending time alone together until I've established myself as a valuable employee based solely on my work." James's face fell. "Martha, that could take months." "Then, it takes months," Martha replied firmly. James, I care about you more than I probably should, given our circumstances. But I need to know that I can make my own way in the world before I let myself depend on anyone else." It was a conversation that revealed the strength of character that had first attracted James to Martha. Despite her feelings for him, she was willing to delay their relationship in order to prove her own worth. It was exactly the kind of principled decision that convinced James she was the right woman for him, even if it meant waiting longer than he wanted. The next morning, Martha requested a meeting with David Whitmore to discuss the future of the breeding program. She had prepared a detailed proposal for expanding the operation, complete with cost projections and timelines. Her presentation was so thorough and professional that David found himself forgetting she was an 18-year-old farm girl with no formal business training. "Miss Kellaway," David said when she finished, "this is exactly the kind of long-term planning I was hoping for when I created this position." "How confident are you in these projections?" "Very confident, sir," Martha replied. "I've researched comparable operations throughout the territory, and I believe our bloodlines give us significant advantages over most competitors." David leaned back in his chair and studied the young woman sitting across from his desk. "I have a confession to make, Miss Kellaway. When I first offered you this position, I was partially motivated by my desire to find a suitable wife for my son. I thought you had the character he needed in a partner, and I created an opportunity for you to get to know each other." Martha's spine stiffened. "I see. However," David continued, "your work here has exceeded my expectations in every way. You've proven yourself to be a valuable employee completely independent of any personal relationship with James. I want you to know that your position here is secure regardless of what happens between you and my son." "Thank you, sir," Martha said carefully. "That means a great deal to me." "There's something else," David added. "I'm prepared to make you a full partner in the horse breeding operation. You would own 25% of the program, with profits distributed accordingly. Your family's agricultural contracts would remain separate from this arrangement." Martha's eyes widened in shock. "Sir, that's incredibly generous, but I'm not sure I understand why you would make such an offer." "Because," David replied, "you've demonstrated that you have the vision and ability to make this program successful beyond anything I originally envisioned. I believe in rewarding excellence when I see it." The offer was more than Martha had ever dreamed possible. Partnership in a successful horse breeding operation could provide financial security for her entire family for generations to come. But it also raised new questions about her relationship with James and her place in the Whitmore family's world. "May I have some time to consider your offer?" Martha asked. "Of course," David replied. "Take all the time you need." That evening, Martha rode home to discuss the unexpected development with her family. The conversation around the Kellaway dinner table was unlike anything they had experienced before, as they grappled with opportunities that seemed almost too good to be real. "A partnership," Thomas mused, shaking his head in amazement. "Martha, do you realize what this means?" "It means we'd never have to worry about losing the farm again," Sarah added. "It means Daniel could go to college if he wanted to." Daniel himself was practically bouncing in his chair with excitement. "Martha, you have to accept. This is the chance of a lifetime." But Martha was thinking about more than just the financial implications. "What about James?" she asked quietly. "If I become his father's business partner, it changes everything about our relationship." "How so?" Thomas asked. "Because then, I wouldn't just be a poor farm girl who happened to help him out of trouble. I'd be someone with real status and wealth of my own. And I need to know that he cares about me as I am now, not as I might become if I accept this partnership." It was a mature and thoughtful concern that demonstrated Martha's wisdom beyond her years. She understood that accepting David's offer would fundamentally change her circumstances and her relationship with the Whitmore family. Before making such a momentous decision, she wanted to be certain about James's feelings for her as she was, not as she might become. The next few days were filled with soul-searching and difficult conversations. Martha spoke with Jake, who encouraged her to accept the partnership because of her genuine talent with horses. She consulted with Ben Crawford, who assured her that David Whitmore's business dealings were always fair and honest. She even had a long conversation with Mrs. Henderson, who had observed the relationship between Martha and James from a unique perspective. "That young man has been different since you arrived," Mrs. Henderson told her. "More focused, more purposeful. And it's not because of your family's circumstances, miss. It's because of who you are as a person." Finally, Martha made her decision. She would accept David's partnership offer, but first she would have one more conversation with James to make sure they understood each other completely. She found James that evening in the ranch's library, reading by lamplight. The room was elegant and comfortable, filled with leather-bound books and expensive furniture, but Martha no longer felt intimidated by such surroundings. "James," she said, "I need to tell you something important." He looked up from his book with the warm smile that never failed to make her heart race. "What is it?" "Your father has offered me a partnership in the breeding program. I'm going to accept it." James set down his book and stood to face her. "That's wonderful news, Martha. You've earned it." "Have I?" Martha asked. "Or is this just another way for your family to manipulate our relationship?" James's expression became serious. "Martha, if you believe that, then you don't know my father as well as I thought you did. He doesn't give away partnerships to anyone, regardless of their personal connections to our family." "And what about you?" Martha asked quietly. "How do you feel about the possibility of being romantically involved with one of your father's business partners?" James stepped closer to her, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his blue eyes. "I think it's perfect. I've been worried that you might always feel inferior in our relationship because of the difference in our financial circumstances. This partnership solves that problem. So you're comfortable with the idea of courting a woman who doesn't need your money?" James smiled broadly. "Martha, I'm thrilled by the idea of courting a woman who doesn't need my money. It means that if you choose to be with me, it's because you actually want to be with me." It was exactly the answer Martha had hoped to hear. James's feelings for her weren't diminished by her potential success, they were strengthened by it. He wanted a partner, not a dependent, and he respected her abilities enough to celebrate her achievements. "In that case," Martha said, stepping closer to him, "I think I'd like to find out what it feels like to be courted by James Whitmore." James reached for her hands, holding them gently in his larger ones. "Are you sure? Because once we start down this path, I'm going to do everything in my power to convince you to marry me." Martha looked into his eyes and saw her future there. A future filled with hard work and mutual respect, with horses and wide open spaces, with a man who valued her for her character rather than her circumstances. "I'm sure," she whispered. James leaned down and kissed her softly, a kiss that tasted of promises and new beginnings. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling. The months that followed brought changes that transformed not only Martha's life but the entire Kellaway family's circumstances. The partnership with David Whitmore proved even more successful than projected, as Martha's innovative breeding techniques produced horses that were in high demand throughout the territory. The agricultural contracts provided steady income that allowed the Kellaways to expand their farming operation and pay off all their debts. Daniel was able to attend the Territorial College, where he studied modern farming techniques that he brought back to improve their family's land. Martha and James's courtship proceeded at a pace that satisfied both of them. They spent their days working together on the ranch and their evenings talking about their dreams for the future. James proved to be as dedicated to the horse breeding program as Martha was, and their partnership in business strengthened their personal relationship. The wedding, when it finally took place the following spring, was a celebration that brought together people from every level of frontier society. Ranch hands sat alongside wealthy ranchers, and poor farmers shared tables with successful businessmen. It was exactly the kind of gathering that reflected Martha and James's belief that a person's worth had nothing to do with their bank account. Martha walked down the aisle of the small frontier church in a simple white dress that she had made herself, carrying wildflowers picked from the prairie that had brought her and James together. She was no longer the destitute prairie girl who had rescued a stranger from an overturned carriage, but she was still the same person who had risked her safety because helping others was the right thing to do. As she placed her hand in James's and spoke her wedding vows, Martha reflected on how much her life had changed since that fateful morning when she heard the sound of a carriage crash in the distance. She had gained financial security, professional success, and the love of a good man, but, more importantly, she had proven to herself and everyone else that character and determination could overcome any obstacle. The frontier newspaper that covered their wedding described it as a union that perfectly exemplifies the democratic spirit of our territory, where worth is measured by deed rather than birth. But, for Martha and James, it was simply the beginning of a partnership that had been built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of love that grows stronger through adversity. Years later, when people asked Martha about the secret to her success, she would always give the same answer: I stopped when someone needed help, and I did what I could with what I had. Everything else just followed from that decision. It was a philosophy that guided not only her marriage and business ventures, but her entire approach to life on the frontier, where helping your neighbors wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the only way anyone could survive and thrive in a challenging but rewarding land of endless possibilities.